The world has entered an era that many had hoped we had left behind. A new gilded age of power concentrated in the hands of a few, cloaked in the language of nationalism, order, and prosperity. Yet beneath that veneer lies a harsh truth. The 21st century has been hijacked by a coalition of strongmen, oligarchs, and technocrats who rule not through consent, but through coercion, convenience, and control. Autocracy today isn't an isolated relic of the past. It's a sophisticated, networked system of repression. It wears many faces. The cult of personality in Russia, the surveillance state in China, the dynastic theocracy in Iran, the hereditary militarism of North Korea. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, aging strongmen cling to power through rigged elections and foreign patronage. In Western-aligned Gulf monarchies, absolute rule is whitewashed by oil wealth and strategic alliances. Each variation is tailored to its own environment, but the core logic remains the same. Power hoarded, dissent crushed, and the people reduced to subjects of the state, not citizens of a shared future. Some autocrats rule with open brutality, arresting journalists, disappearing activists, mowing down protesters in the streets. Others cloak their dominance in legalisms and illusion, manipulated courts, neutered parliaments, and state-run media empires that simulate democracy while eroding its substance. In the digital age, repression has gone wireless. Algorithms amplify propaganda. Bots drown dissent and noise. Surveillance no longer needs wiretaps when every device is a tracker, every online thought a file. An autocrat's promise is always the same: order, security, national greatness. But these are offered as substitutes for freedom, not companions to it. Stability becomes a euphemism for stagnation. Prosperity is reserved for elites. Unity is enforced by fear. Across the globe, these regimes appeal to a deep reactionary impulse, a longing for simpler hierarchies, rigid identities, and scapegoats to blame when the future feels unlivable. This isn't what was supposed to happen. The end of the Cold War was hailed as a triumph of liberal democracy. The 21st century, we were told, would be defined by open societies, the rule of law, global cooperation, and economic interdependence. Democracy, it seemed, had not just won. It had become the baseline. But we were wrong. Instead of expanding, democracy has been on the defensive. Instead of liberalizing, the internet has become a battleground of narrative control. Instead of building inclusive global institutions, the world has fractured into blocks, some liberal, some authoritarian, many simply transactional. We live not in a post-authoritarian age, but in a metastasized authoritarian one. This equilibrium isn't natural. It's constructed. Not permanent. It's brittle. It endures not because it's beloved, but because it's convenient to the powerful and exhausting to the powerless. And while autocracy may appear stable from the outside, inside it's always rotting, corrupt, paranoid, afraid of its own people. But the greatest threat of this new authoritarian age isn't just what the regimes do to their citizens. It's what their existence does to the world. Every day they persist, they normalize the notion that rights are conditional, that elections are optional, that truth is pliable, and that some people simply don't deserve power over their own lives. They erode the moral consensus that underpins global cooperation. They embolden others to follow suit. And they poison the well from which democracy must draw its strength. The belief that a better, freer, fairer world is possible. The twilight struggle of our time isn't the clash of civilizations. It's not a war between East and West or North and South. It's the battle between open and closed societies, between democratic futures and authoritarian dead ends. The autocrats may seem immovable, but they are not inevitable. And once again, as in generations past, we are called to choose sides, not just as nations, but as a species. Authoritarianism is no longer an historic anomaly or a fading relic of the 20th century. It's a living, evolving system of power. Across continents, it has proven itself durable, networked, and adaptive. While liberal democracy struggles to maintain legitimacy and momentum, autocrats have learned to rebrand tyranny not as something to fear, but as something to trust. Start with the obvious: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Washington, D.C. Each claims a unique cultural or historical justification for its concentrated power, be it civilizational destiny, spiritual guardianship, or revolutionary purity. Yet, beneath the rhetoric lies the same foundational pattern: power amassed in the hands of a few, dissent criminalized, and the future narrated as a threat to be managed, not as a possibility to be shaped. Russia's kleptocracy, rooted in oligarchic wealth and enforced by secret police nostalgia, uses war as a unifying spectacle. China's surveillance state, cloaked in Confucian paternalism and economic triumphalism, has fused capitalism with social control to create an Orwellian stability. Iran's theocracy exploits faith to preserve clerical rule, while North Korea's dynastic totalitarianism survives in isolation, weaponized famine, and fear. But this pattern isn't limited to the obvious players. The Middle East remains a patchwork of monarchies and strongman republics, where opposition isn't debated but disappeared. In Africa, cycles of post-colonial trauma have too often paved the way for military juntas and lifetime presidencies, each promising liberation only to deliver extraction. And in Southeast Asia, democratic promises are made and unmade with the stroke of a general's pen. What is most alarming isn't simply that these regimes exist, but that they increasingly learn from one another. Authoritarianism today, which I guess could be a newspaper or a magazine, is no longer national. It's transnational. Through formal alliances and informal exchanges, autocracies are exporting and importing repression. They trade in surveillance software. They coordinate propaganda strategies. They shield each other at the United Nations. And they frame democracy not as flawed, but as fundamentally chaotic, decadent, and weak. Even within so-called free societies, the pressure is mounting. Hungary's Viktor Orban has turned an EU member into a case study in democratic rollback. India, once the world's largest democracy, has seen press freedoms crushed and religious minorities targeted under an increasingly nationalistic regime. And in the United States, institutions meant to safeguard democracy, courts, legislatures, the media, are cracking under the weight of polarization and disinformation, and decades of voter suppression and structural integrity. The world is sliding into a new form of autocracy, one not always imposed by tanks, but invited through fear, fatigue, and frustration. But here's the deeper problem. Legitimacy itself is unraveling. Economic inequality isn't just rising, it's metastasizing. A handful of billionaires control more wealth than half the world's population. In many nations, the promise of upward mobility has collapsed into a daily struggle just to survive. People are no longer simply poor. They are trapped, disposable, unseen. Climate collapse is no longer tomorrow's crisis. It's today's reality. Droughts, floods, and fires redraw borders and rewrite the rules of survival. Whole communities are becoming climate refugees. And in many cases, authoritarian states use these disasters not as wake-up calls, but as pretexts to expand emergency powers. And now, artificial intelligence enters the picture, not just as a tool, but as a force of destabilization. As algorithms replace jobs, shape narratives, and manipulate emotions, the old anchors of authority, governments, experts, media, lose their grip. People are being governed by systems they don't understand, fed truths they can't verify, and watched by machines that never sleep. What does all this add up to? A world where the social contract is fraying, where democracy feels distant, even performative, where trust in institutions, local and global, is plummeting, and where more and more people across the ideological spectrum are beginning to ask the same question: why obey? This is the quiet, rising chorus of the 21st century. It's not just about politics, it's existential. And unless democracy offers more than slogans, unless it delivers safety, fairness, and agency, the autocrats will keep winning by default. But this unraveling also reveals an opening. In the vacuum of legitimacy, there is space to imagine anew. The challenge ahead isn't simply to defeat authoritarianism, but to build something in its place that earns the right to last. We don't advocate democracy out of habit. We don't defend it because it's fashionable or because it flatters the victors of past wars. We don't champion it because it's Western or because it always lived up to its promises, because often it hasn't. We advocate democracy because it's the only known system that grants political power on the basis of consent, not coercion. Because it doesn't presume the superiority of rulers over the ruled. Because, at its best, it allows for the governed to govern. It builds the premise of human dignity into the structure of law. That isn't a cultural preference. It's not a national export. It's a universal moral claim. And let's be clear, this isn't the pursuit of empire by another name. The goal isn't to install regimes in our image, or enforce obedience through war, or destabilize for strategic gain. This isn't the tired script of regime change by drone, by bribe, and by proxy. It's something much larger, and far more difficult. It's the attempt to secure for every person, in every country, on every continent, the right to participate in the decisions that shape their lives. We might call it planetary suffrage, the right to vote without fear, to speak without retaliation, to gather without threat, to organize without surveillance, to imagine without permission. This right isn't the property of the powerful. It doesn't belong to the global north or to those fluent in liberal rhetoric. It's not inherited through citizenship. It's owed by virtue of existence. That idea alone is enough to terrify tyrants. And make no mistake, this vision is radical. It upends centuries of hierarchy. It challenges both traditional empires and modern oligarchies. It threatens those whose wealth depends on silence, whose control depends on apathy, whose rule depends on the lie that people are too ignorant, too tribal, too disorganized to govern themselves. But radicalism isn't only threatening to those with something to lose. For the vast majority of the human population, those who live without political representation, without responsive government, without even the illusion of a voice, this vision isn't dangerous. It's liberating. And it's urgent. Because the current order is collapsing. The legitimacy of institutions is eroding. The tools of oppression are growing faster than the will to resist them. In that context, to defend democracy isn't simply to honor a political system. It's to defend the idea that human beings matter, that their voice matters, that no one, anywhere, should live under power they cannot challenge. This isn't an abstract debate. It's the moral dividing line of the 21st century. And this isn't a dream, stitched together by poets and dissidents. It's not a utopia scribbled on napkins by activists in exile. It's a strategy rooted in power, pressure, and the practical constraints of geopolitics. A strategy, like any worth its salt, begins not with slogans but with prioritization. And the first domino is Belarus, a country caught in suspended animation, no longer Soviet, but not yet free. A state governed by inertia, enforced by police truncheons and KGB holdovers. And beneath the surface, the regime is brittle. Lukashenko holds on not by legitimacy but by fear. His grip isn't secure, it's precarious. And people have already risen once. And they will rise again. Why start here? Because a democratic breakthrough in Belarus would reverberate far beyond its borders. It would shatter the illusion of invincibility that surrounds authoritarian regimes in the former Soviet sphere. It would push pressure directly into the heart of the Kremlin's buffer zone. It would isolate Kaliningrad, known to the Poles as Kroloviec and to the Germans as Königsberg, and fracture the logistical and symbolic integrity of Russia's Western ambitions. But more than that, it would signal to the world that even Moscow isn't immune to the tide of history. Every system of tyranny survives on the belief that it cannot fall. Belarus is where we test that lie. And from there, the structure must scale. Because if Russia is a decaying fortress propped up by oil and nostalgia, China is a fortress made of steel, but with cracks forming in the walls. For decades, Beijing's model, authoritarian capitalism, with a technocratic face, was sold as the future. Efficiency without democracy, prosperity without freedom. But the facade is thinning. Its economy is under immense strain, overbuilt, overleveraged, and overdependent on state intervention. Its youth face record unemployment. Its population is aging. Its birth rate is falling. Its social contract, stability in exchange for silence, is fraying under the weight of censorship, inequality, and broken promises. And its great geopolitical gambit, the Belt and Road Initiative, has left many of its supposed allies with debt, dependency, and disillusionment. China isn't invincible. It's formidable, yes, but not inevitable. And yet, we must be clear. This isn't a call for containment or Cold War. The goal isn't to encircle China or collapse its economy. That's the logic of empire. Our logic is different. We aim not for dominance, but for transformation. And that means engaging with the rest of the world as equals, not as instruments. The global South, so often treated as collateral in the contests of great powers, must be brought in from the margins. These are not pawns to be played against China or Russia or anyone else. They are the co-authors of the next chapter. Without economic justice, there can be no durable political freedom. If people are forced to choose between bread and ballot boxes, they'll choose bread. But if we can help build systems that offer both, livelihood and liberty, stability and voice, then democracy can finally take root, not as a borrowed idea, but as a lived reality. This isn't just about removing dictators. It's about replacing what they've built. Because tearing down a strongman means nothing if the scaffolding of oppression remains. That was the lesson of the 1990s. The prisons stay full. The media stay muzzled. The wealth stays locked in offshore accounts. So we must be deliberate. This movement must come not with bombs, but with ballots. Not with conquest, but with capacity to organize, to reform, to rebuild. Courts that are impartial, media that is independent, economies that are inclusive, governments that are accountable, civil societies that are real. That's the strategy. Not fantasy, not hubris, not missionary democracy at the barrel of a gun, but a global architecture of political dignity, built piece by piece, starting with those most ready to rise, and carried forward not by superpowers, but by people. We live on one planet. This isn't poetry, it's physics. It's carbon molecules and melting ice and orbital mechanics. It's a truth so obvious we overlook it, so urgent we bury it under bureaucracy. But everything we do, every system we build, every structure we defend, happens on this shared sphere of atmosphere, water, and life. And yet, somehow, we remain trapped in a political map that looks like the museum of colonial leftovers. Hundreds of governments, some elected, some imposed, some bought, some born into. Borders drawn in war rooms and palaces. Flags flown over fiefdoms where power is hoarded like stolen gold. And most of us, we never chose any of it. We were just born into jurisdictions, into passports, in the myths about sovereignty that mostly serve to shield the powerful from accountability. That's not democracy. It's tolerated feudalism, digitalized, modernized, and branded for export. Ruled by oligarchs and strongmen dressed up as presidents and leaders. Answerable not to the people, but the party elites, family dynasties, military patrons, and foreign capital. And we still pretend it's normal. We pretend it's normal that hundreds of millions live under regimes that they cannot vote out, that journalists are jailed or dismembered, that opposition parties are outlawed, that protest is met with tanks, not with reforms, that a child's chance to speak freely, love freely, and think critically is determined by coordinates on a map they didn't draw. But what if this time we didn't look away? What if we stopped watching from the sidelines, hoping for the best while bracing for the worst? What if the next global era wasn't defined by another Cold War, another nuclear standoff, another imperial shell game, dressed in the language of balance of power? What if it was defined by the global extension of political self-determination, not imposed by drones or dictated by sanctions, not simulated in puppet parliaments or choreographed elections, not sold through PR campaigns or trade agreements that only enrich the elite, but achieved by people, in struggle, in solidarity, in defiance, in hope? That transformation doesn't begin with policy. It begins with a shift in consciousness. We must stop treating authoritarianism as a regional problem. It's not a Russian problem, not a Chinese problem, not an Iranian or North Korean or Saudi or Hungarian or Egyptian or now an American problem. It's a planetary problem, a shared malignancy in the bloodstream of modern civilization. It's the authoritarianism of the state, yes, but also of corporations, algorithms, ideologies, and inherited power. It's the rule of the few over the many, wherever that imbalance thrives. And so the cure must also be planetary. It must transcend languages, flags, currencies, and time zones. It must unite people across geographies, not because we are naive, but because we are out of time to stop climate collapse without coordinated governance, out of time to protect human rights without mutual defense, out of time to fix extractive economics without global redistribution, out of time to defend democracy if each nation must do it alone. Because if democracy dies in Moscow, it doesn't survive in Munich. If it's choked in Cairo, it trembles in Caracas. If it's crushed in Beijing, it buckles in Berlin and Boston and Buenos Aires. We don't need another alliance of governments. We need an alliance of peoples. A planetary movement, not for one ideology, but for one principle, that those who live under a system should have the power to shape it. That democracy isn't Western or Eastern, it's human. That dignity isn't a gift to be granted by regimes, it's a right to be claimed. And that no matter how many palaces are built, how many firewalls are raised, how many prisons are filled, truth travels, movements spread, and the arc of history, though twisted and bloodied, still bends, not by accident, not by force, by courage, by people. This episode is only the beginning, a prologue, a foundation, a declaration that something is deeply broken in our world, and that it's not enough to simply diagnose the problem. We have to dismantle it. In the episodes that follow, I'll turn the lens to the concrete pillars of modern autocracy, not just the abstract ideas or historical patterns, but the living, breathing regimes that hold millions hostage and shape the global climate of fear. I'm going to start in Belarus, a country too often forgotten, trapped in the long shadow of Russia's ambition, and ruled by a man who styles himself as the last dictator of Europe. We'll examine how Lukashenko maintains control, how civil society resists, and why the world looked away. Then we'll turn to Russia itself. More than a country, now a blueprint, a model of 21st century autocracy that wields military aggression, cyber warfare, and imperial nostalgia to hold its people captive while destabilizing democracies abroad. We'll examine the myth of Russian strength and trace the fractures underneath. From there, China, the surveillance leviathan, a regime that fuses digital control with ancient authoritarian instincts, seeking not only to suppress dissent, but to manufacture a version of reality to which dissent is unthinkable. We'll explore the logic of control behind the Great Firewall, the repression of Xinjiang, and the social credit systems that foreshadow a future we must refuse. Then to Iran, a theocracy where faith is used as a weapon, and women are punished for claiming their voices. We'll trace the lineage of protest, from the Green Movement to the Women Life Freedom Uprising, and ask whether a society can survive when it denies the dignity of half its people. We'll visit the Gulf monarchies, where oil wealth masks political stagnation, where dissent is criminalized under the language of tradition, and where Western complicity remains thick and unresolved. There, repression wears designer suits, but it kills just the same. And we won't stop at the borders of official autocracies. We'll look inward at the fragile democracies, where the rot of authoritarianism is spreading beneath the surface. Hungary, where Orban has rewritten democracy into something unrecognizable. India, where institutions of pluralism are slowly being replaced by majoritarian nationalism. And the United States, where institutional decay, racial division, and political violence have reawakened questions we thought were settled. But this series is not simply to be a tour of oppression. It's not a catalog of grievances. It's a map of pressure points. In each case, we'll explore what sustains the regimes, economically, militarily, ideologically, where they're vulnerable, what cracks are forming, what movements are rising, and how internal resistance and external solidarity might push the arc of history toward justice. We'll go beyond individual rulers, beyond parties or politics. We'll confront the underlying structures, the financial systems that reward corruption, the algorithms that privilege hate. the trade networks that stabilize tyrannies while impoverishing the global majority. We'll ask openly and without apology what democracy must become to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Can it still mean something more than elections, more than slogans? Can it be rebuilt to offer dignity, voice, and protection, not just to the few, but to the many? And throughout, I'll invite you, wherever you live, however you see the world, to join something larger. Not just a conversation, not just a show, but a movement. A movement for planetary suffrage. The radical but necessary idea that every human being, everywhere, should have a say in the conditions of their life. That democracy isn't the property of nations, but the right of people. That borders may define states, but they should not define who matters. We'll not ask you to pledge allegiance to a country, a party, or a creed. I'll ask you only this. Do you believe that power should be answerable to the people? If the answer is yes, then you already belong to this movement. This is episode 0, the beginning of the beginning. Let's build what comes next together. Let's begin.